dil derslik yapmak üzere Birçok Üniversitesi öğretim üyesi Prof.Dr. Ha-Joon Chang İstanbul davet etmek üzere Merkez Üniversitesi'nden Prof.Dr. Erdem'i kürsüye davet ediyor.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to introduce Ha-Joon Chang. He is a Korean national and has taught at the Faculty of Economics, University of Cambridge since 1990. In addition to numerous articles in journals and edited volumes, Chang has published 15 authored books, 5 of them co-authored, and 10 edited books. His main books include The Political Economy of Industrial Policy in 1994, Kicking Away the Ladder, Development Strategy in Historical Perspective in 2002, The Samaritans, Rich Nations, Poor Policies, and the Threat to the Developing World in 2007. From the 3 things that they don't tell you about capitalism until 2010, and Economics, the User's Guide in 2014. By the end of 2016, his writings will have been translated into 38 languages and published in 40 countries. His books have sold around 1.8 million copies worldwide. Apart from his academic activities, Ha-Joon Chang has worked as a consultant for numerous international organizations, including various UN agencies like ILO, FAO, INTEC, UNIDO, and UNDP, the World Bank, the European Investment Bank, and Asian Development Bank. He has also worked as a consultant for a number of governments: Argentina, Brazil, Canada, Ecuador, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Mexico, Namibia, Singapore, South Africa, the UK, Uruguay, Venezuela, and Vietnam, and various NGOs such as Action Aid, CAFOD, Christian Aid, Oxfam. Ha-Joon Chang is the winner of the 2003 Müdürü Prize, awarded to his book, Kicking Away the Ladder, by the European Association for Evolutionary Political Economy. He is also the winner, jointly with Richard Nelson of Columbia University, of the 2005 Leontief Prize for Advancing the Frontiers of Economic Thought, awarded by Tufts University. Winners of the prize include the Nobel laureates Amartya Sen and Daniel Kahneman, as well as John Kenneth Galbraith and Albert Hirschman. He was ranked number 9 in the Prospect magazine's World Thinkers 2014 poll. Okay, I'd like to introduce you, please. It's your time.
Well, thank you, Professor Erdem, for the elaborate introduction. And thank you everyone for coming to listen to me. Well, it is my great honor to give a lecture named after Ibn Khaldun, as he is called in Turkey, or Ibn Khaldun, as he is more commonly known, because he's one of the founding fathers of the historical approach to economics, which is one of the key methods that I use in my research. Well, I must confess that I have read only the introductory chapter of his magnum opus, Mukaddima, published in 1377. I read the rest of the book in cursory manner, but I have read only the introductory chapter carefully. And his starting point in the study of history is not to accept supposed historical facts blindly. He points out that people accept facts blindly because they didn't check the stories with the principles underlying the situation, or they didn't compare them with similar materials. So, very much at the starting off his the methodological exposition with an emphasis on ascertaining facts. And unfortunately, as I'll try to show in my lecture today, the prevailing history of capitalism, especially the history of industrial policy, is full of such errors. Many myths parade themselves as facts, while the theoretical principles that motivated past policy actions are not recognized, or if they are recognized at all, they are dismissed as outdated intellectual relics. I'm beginning to sound too serious, so let me begin my lecture with a little story which happened in 1958. That year, Japan tried to export its first passenger cars to the United States. The company was called Toyota. The car was called Toyo Pet, and as you can guess from the name, it is a cheap, small car which Toyota hoped prosperous American consumers would pick up with changes left over from their grocery shopping. Despite being really cheap and affordable, no one wanted to buy the car, so much so that Toyota actually had to officially withdraw the product from the market. Some of you must have seen this movie, Men in Black, the neuralizer. The car was never here. Well, it's not a surprise when you see what the car looked like, because it looked like this. Would you buy this car? I wouldn't. This started a very heated debate in Japan. The free market economists, especially centered around the central bank, the Bank of Japan, argue that this is what happens when a country tries to go against its comparative advantage. Japan is a country that has a lot of labor and very little capital, and we should concentrate on labor-intensive products. Indeed, at the time, the biggest export item of Japan was silk, a very labor-intensive product. And the Japanese car industry was, frankly, a joke. In 1955, I don't have the figure for 1958, in 1955, the United States produced 7 million cars. The 12 Japanese companies put together produced 70,000 cars. The biggest Japanese company, namely Toyota, produced half of that, 35,000. The biggest American company, the General Motors, produced 100 times of that, 3.5 million cars. So, the free market economists had very strong ground to argue for the abolition of all these protection and subsidies going to Toyota and other car companies. And they were also in a position to point out that the Japanese car industry had all the help that we could reasonably expect. Because when it was first set up in 1933, the Japanese car industry got heavy tariff protection. In 1933, in the build-up to the, 1938, in the build-up to the Pacific War, the Japanese government kicked out the two foreign producers, which at the time were dominating the Japanese car market, namely Ford and General Motors. And since then, no foreign company was allowed back again, even after Japan lost the war and the Americans were running the country until 1952. And the bank, the economists at the central bank had a particular pleasure in pointing out that back in 1949, the Bank of Japan injected public money to bail out Toyota from bankruptcy. Yeah, so they said that you had 25 years of high tariff protection, 20 years without any foreign companies trying to compete against you, and only 10 years ago, a major public bailout, and you still cannot make it work. It's time to give up. Today we think Japanese cars as something as natural as, I don't know, French wine or Scottish salmon, or Turkish olive. But less than 2 generations ago, there were lots of people, including many Japanese themselves, who thought that the industry has no reason to exist. Now, luckily for Japan, and I would say for the rest of the world, which has eventually benefited from better cars, the protectionists won the argument, and the Japanese government continued with its support for the industry, and the rest is history. Today, Toyota looks like this. Well, it's the luxury brand Lexus, and it's the biggest car company in the world. But don't assume that this was an easy journey, because even after the Japanese government decided to continue with the protection for the auto industry, it took another 15 years for Japanese companies to break into the world market. After that, it took another 25 years before it entered the luxury market, where they sell things like Lexus. Yeah, I still remember when, the Japanese companies in the late 1980s announced their plan to produce luxury models. A lot of people laughed at it. They said, Japanese luxury car, that's an oxymoron, isn't it? Japan is where cheap things are made, second-rate things are made. How do they think they will compete with the Germans? Well, we have the proof here. Okay, so when you meet the free trade economist next time, ask him what car he drives, what car he drives. If he drives a Japanese car, or a Korean car for that matter, which was developed in the same way as the Japanese cars, he doesn't know what he's talking about. You have to practice what you preach. You should not buy things like the Toyota if you believed in the free trade. Anyway, I can give you many stories like Toyota from Japan, or many other stories from my own country, South Korea. But when I give these examples, the usual reaction is, oh yeah, but Japan and Korea are exceptions. All the other countries, from Britain in the 18th century, the United States in the 19th century, they all developed through free trade and free market policy. But the fact is that starting with 18th century Britain, virtually all of today's rich countries developed by using policies like trade protection, subsidies, regulation of foreign direct investment, and the use of state-owned enterprises, which are all policies that developing countries are not supposed to use these days. Okay, let's briefly look at this history. I mean, I've written various things to give you the details, but let's look at the outline. You know, today Britain is believed to be the country that invented free trade, but it is actually the country that invented protectionism. Especially between 1721, when this man came to power, this is someone called Robert Walpole. He's known as the first British Prime Minister, although he was not called the Prime Minister, but at the time the title was Chief Minister, but you know, he was the first British Prime Minister who came to power in 1721. Very interestingly, you know, he's today remembered as, I mean, for basically his corruption. You know, he was a fantastically corrupt person, but he was also a very competent manager, economic manager. So he was brought in to clean up the mess left by the 1721 South Sea bubble. This was a famous speculative episode in British financial history, where the shares of this the company called South Sea Company, which really didn't have any profit to show for, rose within 10 months 9 times. And most famously, Isaac Newton lost a fortune in that speculative frenzy. And this left the country in a total mess, and Walpole was brought in to clean up the mess. Yes, he did clean up the mess, but he also introduced a series of industrial policy measures that very much look like what countries like Japan and Korea used later. So protection for the domestic producers, export subsidies, lowering of tariffs on industrial inputs so that exporters can maintain their competitiveness, you know, quality control on export by the state, lots of things, you know. I don't have time to go into the detail. So between Walpole, who introduced these policies, and the 1850s, really, Britain had a very protectionist regime. And yeah, you can see it from this table. I mean, it's rather incomplete because of, you know, the problem in acquiring historical data, but it's mainly based on the information collected by the late Swiss economic historian Paul Baroque. And yeah, you can see that in 1820, Britain had the highest tariff rate in the world. I mean, okay, I mean, you might be saying, well, how is that the world? Because there are only about 15 countries. Yeah? But actually, in terms of tariff, this is almost the world, because for much of this period, countries that do not appear on this table were either colonies or were subject to unequal treaties. I mean, Turkey was a victim of that, yeah? The Lausanne Treaty, which deprived it the right to set its own tariffs. So actually, there are only like the only country I can think of which could appear here is Norway, but then Norway was the same country as Sweden until 1905. I mean, Portugal doesn't appear here, but you know, Portugal in the 19th century was also forced to sign its version of unequal treaties with Britain. So basically, of the countries which had the right to set their own tariffs until the early 19th century, Britain was the most protectionist. And it was on the basis of these historical facts that Friedrich List, the 19th century German economist, who is today commonly but mistakenly, as I'll explain later, known as the father of the so-called infant industry argument, condemned the British advocacy of free trade as an act equivalent to kicking out the ladder. So what is he saying? I mean, he's saying, well, the British tell us, the Germans and Americans, you know, at the time the two countries very much identified with each other, to adopt free trade. But when you actually look at British history, they didn't get rich through free trade. They did it all through protection subsidies. So Britain telling other countries not to use these policies is like someone climbing up to the top using a ladder and kicking the ladder away so that other people cannot follow. You don't need to read this. It's all summarized in this cartoon that was on the cover of my earlier book. Now, if Britain was the first country to have succeeded in using infant industry protection to develop its economy, the first country to have actually theorized it is the United States. And the person who did that is an American who is so famous that despite the fact that he's been dead for like over 200 years, you have all seen his face. Yeah? You all know him, yeah? Except that you don't know who he is. Yeah? It's this guy, Alexander Hamilton, the first Treasury Secretary of the United States of America. Yeah? Hamilton became the US Treasury Secretary at an outrageously young age of 33 in 1789. And in 1791, he submits this report to the US Congress called the Treasury Secretary's report on the subject of manufacture. And there he develops this theory which says that the government of a relatively backward nations need to protect and nurture its young industries against superior foreign competitors until they grow up and can face the competition on their own. This was a very simple but a very powerful idea. And in order to explain that in a more intuitive way, in this book, Bad Samaritans, whose Turkish version is available in this conference venue, I explain it with the example of my son. In this book, I have a chapter called My 6-year-old Son Should Get a Job. Now, the children have this annoying habit of growing up, so he's now 15, but he was really 6 when I wrote the book. And the way I explain it is, I start with the observation that, well, of course, I don't use such colorful language in the book, but I say that my son is a total parasite. Yeah, I pay for everything. Yeah? His food, his accommodation, his education, healthcare, yeah? His toys, his Nintendo games. Yeah? So I get to think, actually he's a major drain on my resource. And why can't you work? You go to Pakistan, you go to Ecuador, there are children who work from the age of 4 or 5. He's perfectly capable of making a living. Yeah, I should make him quit his school and send him to work. And then I realized that this is a real win-win solution. Because not only will I save a lot of money, he'll become a better person. He'll be exposed to the rigors of competition in the labor market. He'll have to practice his skills to earn money. I don't know what it is, shoe shining, selling chewing gums, whatever it is. No more wasting time with his Nintendo games. No more fooling around with his TV. Yeah, so it's a brilliant solution. But why do people not do this? Well, I don't know about other people, but my reasoning is, he's quite a clever kid. I reckon, and so far it's proving, to be the right decision. He will study well and can become lots of things. I don't know. Architect, nuclear physicist, genetic engineer, whatever. So I'm willing to invest in this guy. Of course, there's a danger that he will turn out to be a total waste of time. He could be, 33 and unemployed and live with me, like Jesus Christ used to. But even if there's a 30% or even 50% chance that he will turn out like that, I'm willing to invest in him. Because I know that if I kick him into the labor market at the age of 6 and expose him to full competition, there's no chance that he can become an architect or nuclear physicist. Okay, he might work hard at developing his shoe shining skills and save a bit of money and buy, I don't know, a street food stall and sell fried noodles, and then maybe he can, if he really works hard, save up and buy a small shop. Yeah? But that'll be it. Yeah? Anyway, so this is a very powerful but very simple insight. In order to enable your industries to compete with the big guys in the future, you need to invest in them. Yeah? So you have to see this the logic as a logic of investment in building productive capabilities. Of course, this may have been a brilliant idea, but in saying this, he was going against the greatest economist at the time, Adam Smith himself, who explicitly advised the Americans not to artificially develop manufacturing industries. The countries that advantage that lie in agriculture, if you actually artificially try to develop your industries through protection and so on, you're actually only going to damage yourselves. And given this, it's no surprise that the US Congress rejected Hamilton's proposal. He basically proposed that the average tariff rate, which was about 5% at the time, should be raised to like around 40%. Yeah? And that's only the average. I mean, some industries would get even more protection. And a lot of people, especially including Thomas Jefferson, Hamilton's political archenemy, very correctly argued that this is nonsense. At the moment, we can export our cotton and tobacco to Europe and buy manufactured products from Europe that are not only better but also cheaper. Why should we subsidize these inefficient Yankee manufacturers? I mean, Hamilton was a powerful guy. He was, after all, Washington's right-hand man. So the US Congress couldn't completely ignore him. So they raised the tariff to about 10%, 12%, and then didn't accept the other parts of his proposal, sent him away. Hamilton unfortunately died at a relatively young age of 49 in 1804 in a pistol duel. But over time, people saw senses in his argument, and the US adopted protectionism after the end of the Anglo-American War of 1812 to 16. And from about the 1830s until the Second World War, the US was most protectionist country in the world most of the time. I mean, you can see it from this table. Similar story applies to other rich countries of today. Most of them use bad policies, protectionism, subsidies, regulations, state-owned enterprises. So let me just briefly outline those. So all these countries, except for the Netherlands and Switzerland up to First World War, use protectionism. As I tried to tell you, Britain and US, despite their reputation of homes of free trade, were actually the most protectionist economies in the world in their respective catch-up periods. And even when the average tariff was not so high, high protection was provided for targeted strategic industries. I mean, Germany and Sweden did that in the late 19th, early 20th century. Their average tariff was, not low, about 20–25%, but for heavy and chemical industries, the protection is much higher. Belgium in the mid-19th century had only about 10% average tariff rate, but some sectors got 85%, 60% protection. Foreign direct investment was heavily regulated when these countries were at the receiving end. So in the 19th century, the US very heavily regulated FDI in finance, shipping, mining, and logging. I mean, until 1914, foreign ownership in coastal shipping was completely banned. In banking, only American citizens could become directors in a national bank, and foreign shareholders could draw dividends but could not vote in shareholders' meetings. Now, can you imagine, I mean, a developing country doing something like that today? I mean, probably the US government will send in the Marines. Japan and Korea in time, to a lesser extent, virtually banned foreign direct investment until the 1980s. Finland classified all funds with more than 20% foreign ownership as dangerous enterprises. And I haven't invented the term, it's the official Finnish term. So foreigners got this subtle hint and kept away. State-owned enterprises, yet Germany and Japan used, I mean, they basically played the role of venture capitalists. Set up these state-owned enterprises in new industries when they were starting their industrialization, develop them, subsidize them, and when they could stand on their own feet, they privatized them. State-owned enterprises were extensively used in France, Finland, Austria, Norway, Taiwan, Singapore after the Second World War. In Singapore, they account for a staggering 22% of GDP. This is the highest share outside the oil economy. Yeah, actually, Singapore is a very interesting example because when you read about Singapore in, I don't know, Wall Street Journal or the Economist magazine or in standard textbooks, you will only hear about this free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has. But you will never be told that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government and 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation and 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises. I often put it to my students, look, I mean, give me one economic theory, it doesn't matter what it is, Marxist, neoclassical, Keynesian, Schumpeterian, one economic theory that can single-handedly explain Singapore, I dare say there's no such theory. The world is a lot more complex than the theories that think it is. The US is a very interesting case because I say that at the official level, it is one of the smallest state-owned enterprise sector in the world, producing only about 1% of GDP. But it has one of the most successful state-owned enterprises in human history, except that it's not called a state-owned enterprise, it's called the US military. Most of the sectors in which the US has international technological leadership were, there's something missing there, developed and financed by the US military, from through its R&D support, through procurement support. So computer and internet, well, basically the Pentagon financed it. This is less well known. Semiconductor was basically developed by the US Navy. Aircraft, without all those research support and privilege in procurement, the U.S. aircraft in military, the planes, the U.S. aircraft manufacturers would not have had the same amount of resource to deploy in the civilian aircraft sector. So the history of capitalism is, well, I'm being a bit dramatic here, but basically a history of state interventionism rather than that of free trade and free market. Of course, as some people have pointed out, the coexistence of these policies and interventionist policies and economic development does not prove that the former caused the latter. Well, that probably is the case, although I don't think so. But what I can say with confidence is that free trade and free market policies cannot be the cause of economic development in these countries because they simply didn't exist. I mean, how can you attribute Britain's success to free trade when there was no free trade? Never mind, causality, causation, Of course, when I say this, some free trade economists counter that, well, these countries succeeded despite, not because of these protectionist policies, because they had other countervailing forces. So, for example, the US had very high protection. Yes, we recognize that. However, it was bound to grow fast. Yeah? The big domestic market, the huge amount of natural resources, it received a lot of immigration from other countries. Yeah? So the US could have grown even faster without those protectionist policies. It sounds quite plausible, and it probably works that if you're just looking at one country. But if the large domestic market was so important, how do you explain Finland? Yeah? Finland in its the developmental period basically had 3 million people, yeah? And was very protectionist. Yeah? If the natural resources are so good, why do people talk about natural resource curse? How do you then explain the success of countries like South Korea or Japan? If immigration was so good, how about the countries that were sending people to the United States? Yeah? Germany, Sweden, yeah, Taiwan, you know, all the bright, enterprising people all went to the United States, and you know, they were left with arguably second-rate people. You know. So I think this so-called offsetting conditions argument may work when you are looking at one country in isolation, but when you have 20, 30 countries that have all used these the bad policies, which have all very different conditions in terms of size and immigration, natural resource, you cannot really say that you know these the policies made things worse. You know? Of course, the fact that the theory of infant industry was at the basis of almost all development success stories doesn't mean that the theory alone is enough in guaranteeing economic development. You know, this is an important point because you know, a lot of people try to achieve something through the same method. Some people do better than others. So we have to understand why there is a difference between countries. And many factors that have been discussed. I mean, I don't have time to go into them. You know, political and institutional factors. Including things like the quality of public administration. Also, we need to look at, I mean, this is a point that was emphasized by Mr. Aydin in the morning. You know, we need to look at the complementarity between the infant industry promotion program and other policies. You know, for example, if you use the macroeconomic policy that leads to currency overvaluation and excessively high real interest rates, like they used to in countries like South Korea, South Africa, and Brazil in the 90s and 2000s. I mean, however good your industrial policy is, you are not going to make people invest and innovate. You know, in most countries, the profit rate of non-financial corporations is at between 3 and 7%. And when you have like the 10%, 12% real interest rate, it's actually a miracle that some businessmen bother to invest. Yeah, because you can buy government bond and earn much higher earning. So actually, I doff my hat to the businessmen in South Africa and Brazil who actually bother to run business. Yeah? I mean, that kind of environment, of course, the business cannot borrow to invest. Yeah? So you have that very restrictive business environment. And many other things. I mean, once again, I don't have time to go into them. I'm very happy to discuss them at other opportunities. So there are all these other factors, but let me just focus on two groups of policies that are more in the realm of industrial policy itself. First of all, infant industry protection only creates this space in which companies can improve their productive capability. But it does not automatically lead to productivity increase. Yeah? Of course, I mean, there's some, you know, of what Kenneth Arrow called learning by doing. You know, you improve your productivity simply because you keep doing the same thing. But apart from that, you actually need to consciously invest in increasing productive capabilities by investing in machines, R&D, worker skills, and this is where the success cases and failure cases had a big difference. Yeah? So what kind of incentive do you provide? What kind of support do you give to enable firms to invest in those productivity enhancing activities? Yeah? And secondly, in order to maximize its success, an infant industry program needs to be accompanied by policies to promote export. My view is that economic development is impossible without good export performance. Because if you are a developing country, you need to import technologies. By definition, you are a developing country because you cannot generate your own technologies. And where are you going to get the money for that? Well, basically by exporting whatever you have. And by neglecting the export sector, many developing countries undermine their own infant industry program because these industries need constant injection of progressing technologies, and if you don't have the foreign exchange to buy them, then you are finished. So I put a lot of emphasis on the need to increase export, but this is not to say that we need therefore free trade. I mean, that's the logical leap that many people often commit. Yeah? No, these two things are not the same. Actually, if you look at countries like Japan and Korea, export promotion and infant industry protection were totally integrated. Yeah, so if you look at those countries, you start by, since you don't have any natural resource other than some fish, you start by exporting some of the lowest grade labor intensive products. I mean, stitched garment, wigs, cheap transistor radio. But you earn those the foreign exchanges through those exports. You use them to build the next generation of infant industries, protected through tariffs and other measures. Of course, you cannot leap from making cheap garments to making automobile overnight, so you have to do something slightly better, like putting together black and white TV and textile and so on. But you use that money to go to the next step and so on. So actually these two things are not incompatible. Actually, unless you constantly generate new generation of infant industries, your export drive will get stuck. This is what happened with countries like Malaysia and Thailand and to an extent Turkey, which are supposed to be stuck in the middle income trap. Yes, you have built the ability to produce and export certain easier things, but you are stuck now because you haven't raised the next generation of infants. Also, export success requires significant industrial policy, even for comparative advantage conforming industries, because export markets have high fixed cost of entry, which small firms and small farmers may not be able to bear. This is why you need state help. I mean, of course, direct export subsidies are banned by the WTO, but you can provide other forms of help, the export loan guarantees, state marketing help, technical the advice to help small exporters to meet quality standards and so on. So I would say that this unfortunate dichotomy between export promotion and import substitution, it really clouded our vision, because these two things have to go together to be successful. Anyway, so far we have seen that history provides us with ample lessons as to how we design an industrial policy development program industrial development program. Of course, the thing about history is that it's constantly evolving, so we cannot directly apply some policy that was successful in the past somewhere else to your country today without significant modification. Indeed, even Khaldun himself warned against trying to apply the lessons from history directly to today's situation. I'm not going to read that out. So let me spend the last 5 minutes of my talk briefly outlining how we interpret the changes in the global economy, some of which was actually discussed by other speakers this morning. So maybe I can be a bit light on them. Well, 2 changes have been frequently mentioned by commentators as reasons to reject the relevance of history for today's industrial policy. One is the rise of the post-industrial service economy, and the other is the changes in the global economic environment, which itself is decomposed into 2 elements. One is the rise of transnational corporations, and the other is the changes in the global rules of trade and investment after the WTO. Now, according to the discourse of post-industrial service economy, industrial policy itself that becomes unnecessary. I mean, this is industrial policy narrowly defined, because making things doesn't matter anymore. Yeah? I mean, now the value is mainly added by companies like Apple, who come up with ideas. Manufacturing is a low-grade activity that countries like China and Vietnam can do. So we should just jump directly into the service industry. The supporters of this view cite cases like Switzerland and Singapore as examples of service-based prosperity, and India is also mentioned. Well, unfortunately, this argument fundamentally misunderstands the nature of this economic change. I mean, I'm not saying that there hasn't been so-called deindustrialization, but the nature of the process is a lot more complex than what is suggested here. So first of all, the increasing share of services in output does not mean that material production is not important anymore. We are actually, in fact, consuming an ever-increasing amount of material goods, and many countries are actually producing even more material goods than ever in absolute terms. The rise in the share of services happens mainly because services are becoming relatively more expensive because of the relatively slower rate of productivity growth. Yeah? Just think about it. I mean, the kind of relative price fall that things like computers and mobile phones, especially when you take into account the quality improvement vis-a-vis having a haircut or riding on a taxi, is staggering. So a lot of deindustrialization happens because of this. Also, a significant proportion of this increase, here the data are difficult to get, so I cannot tell you exactly what, but that could be 10%, 20% of deindustrialization is due to changes in organization rather than the increasing importance of service activities themselves. Yeah? Because these days, a lot of companies have spun off or outsourced service activities that they used to perform themselves. Yeah? From high-grade things like design and engineering to low-grade things like catering and cleaning. These all used to be counted as manufacturing output. Now they are produced by the specialized service companies. So people think service activities have become more important, but in terms of the activities, they are basically doing the same things, yeah? Under different the label. Yeah? Also, most high-value services cannot prosper without a strong manufacturing base because they basically sell to manufacturing companies.
But how about countries like Switzerland and Singapore? You know, don't they show us that that we can become rich on the basis of banking and design services and things like that? Well, here again, there are huge factual errors of the kind that would have made even Ha-Joon very angry. Let's talk about some of them. Well, let's. Oh yeah. This movie, which was made in 1949, called The Third Man. This was set in post-Second World War Vienna, and it's basically about the black market in penicillin. And this movie script was written by Graham Greene, the British novelist, and he later turned it into a novel. But apparently there's one bit of the dialogue, or rather in this case a monologue, written by the leading actor, the legendary American actor Orson Welles. And Orson Welles in the movie appears as this evil character called Harry Lime. And the bit of dialogue he wrote was when he was exposed by his the friend as an evil drug lord, and he launches into this diatribe saying, well, you know, being good is pointless, you know. When did being good do anything good, you know? Evil is good. You know? So this is how he puts it. You know? He says, in Italy, under the Borgias, we had all the bad things about human nature. Terror, murder, bloodshed, but they gave us the Renaissance. Switzerland, they lived in the harmony and peace, brotherly love for 500 years. And what did that give us? The Cuckoo Clock. Yes, you know, this is the view of Switzerland that most people have. You know, it's a boring little country where nothing happens and they produce cuckoo clock, and sell it to American and Japanese tourists. Or if you want to put it in positive light, you would say that it's a model post-industrial economy, because without producing anything other than chocolate and cuckoo clocks, it is very, very rich. Banking, tourism. Well, actually, the interesting thing is that these little 3 short sentences basically contain 5 factual errors. So it must be the largest number of factual errors per word in history. So let's see what it has got wrong. Well, 500 years of democracy, well, I don't know about other people, but I don't call a country where half the population cannot vote a democracy. Women got votes only in 1971. Even later, if you count these 2 rural cantons. 500 years of peace, well, not quite true. They had a few fights with their neighbors. And 500 years of brotherly love? No, they had the 4 civil wars in 200 years. And the cuckoo clock was not invented in Switzerland, it was invented in Germany. And finally, Switzerland is the most industrialized country in the world. It produces the highest amount of manufacturing value added per person. Of course, it's a small country, so you don't notice. And also it specializes in producer goods, so you don't see many Swiss made in Switzerland products, but this is what it is. Now, by criticizing the discourse of post-industrial service economy, I'm not trying to say that nothing has changed. Given the recent changes in the way production is organized, today's industrial policymakers need to get away from the traditional divide between manufacturing and services and pay more attention to the development of specialized providers of producer services, because they are becoming increasingly important for the development in manufacturing. Okay, I have run out of time. So yeah, this is the India. Why is not a service-based success story? Well, I'm happy to make this the PowerPoint available to the participants so that you can read them at your leisure. I discuss how the changes in the global economy, like rise in FDI or changing rules of the international trade and investment, are of course there and significant, but tend to be exaggerated, and there are still importantly room for maneuver in terms of the policy tools. More than what Professor Erdogan suggested earlier, I think. But yes, the restriction is has increased, and they need to be taken into account. Okay, so to conclude, I have tried to discuss the challenges of industrial policy for developing countries from a historical perspective, and in doing so, I have tried to follow Ibn Khaldun's the three key principles in his historical methodology. First, we need to check the facts. Second, we need to understand the theoretical principles underlying historical events. And thirdly, we need to see history as a constantly evolving thing and try to take into account changing conditions when applying lessons from history. And following these principles, I have been, well, I hope, able to provide a perspective on industrial policy that is rather different from the mainstream one. I don't expect you to have become, convinced that by this in the first instance. But I hope at least my speech would have made you see things somewhat differently. Thank you.
Just have 5 minutes to take questions. Please ask your questions briefly to have more questions. Only 5 minutes.
Yeah, can we collect like 3-4 questions and I answer them all?
Or 3 questions?
Yeah.
Or okay, that's good.
So, at the back.
Thank you. Your name please first.
It's working? Okay. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Arif Darmon. I am from Indonesia. I'm a student at Marmara University, Department of Developmental Economics and Economic Growth. I'm so happy and excited to meet Professor Ha-Joon Chang because I know him last year. For my assignment, I reviewed your book about 23 things about capitalism. So it is the interesting book that I read so far, and it's very, very different. So now I came here and it surprised me that I can meet you. So I hope that it will be inspired me more to become a good economist in the future. And considering about the presentations, I'm really happy to see about your presentation. And my questions, I have 2 questions for you. The first one is about the industrializations. I take notes from your books about the industrializations, especially when you compare China as a workshop of the world. Many products, you talk to your son in your previous book, Bad Samaritans, about many products is produced by the China. And you compared also about the revolution industry in England, which is held in the 18th century. There is like 46% of the industrial coming from UK or England. So I want to ask about your opinion about China now, about the industrialization. What do you think about China, about the industry in China? Because we know that even for the mobile phone, everything is produced or made in China. And the second is I want to make a point about the G20, which is Turkey become the host of the G20. and next week they will hold the Leaders Forum in Antalya. Considering about the G20, I want to also get your idea about how to make a beneficial of the G20 as the grouping of the best 20 economic countries in the world for another country. We know it that now Turkey proposed for 3 principles of the G20 for this meeting. So based on your idea, what is the opinion for G20, especially related about the industrial policy and how to make the beneficial for the developing countries and the emerging countries?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes. Please, the lady.
Please.
Hi, Gülay Rifkirgim from Şekilde, Chief Economist. My question will be about Turkey's economy. You know, we have a current economic deficit problem, which is structural, and other structural problems. I don't know whether you follow, but what would be your advice for Turkish economy transition in the new global environment? That will be my question. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, let me ask those 3 questions. Well, first of all, China, you know, I'm somewhat less optimistic about China than most other people because it's got tremendous internal tensions coming from rising inequality and, you know, the nature of the political system and so on. But I think it's made sure that it has invested in building the necessary productive capabilities that will take it to the next stage. You know, China's per capita income is in current dollars less than $5,000, but it's investing like 1.6, 1.7% of GDP in research and development. Mexico, which has twice that per capita income, invests only 0.4%. I don't know what the figure is for Turkey, but I'd be surprised if it's even 1%. You know, sorry? Yeah. So you're not doing as badly as I thought you were, but and the kind of infrastructure investment that isn't made. You know, India's grown quite fast in the last couple of decades, but it's grinding to a halt because of infrastructure constraint. So I think China will make it. You know, once again we laugh. Oh well, the Chinese are trying to get into the mobile phone market. Yeah? This is what they said about Japan in the 1950s. This is what they said about South Korea in the 1970s. You know, I still remember in 1977, one of the newspaper headline was South Korea export cars. Yeah? Found out that we sold 6 cars to Ecuador. Yeah? It was a joke. Yeah? But China's been progressing much faster, so you know, watch the space. Yeah? G20, I think basically what the G20 should do is to make the rich countries accept that different countries at different stages of development need different policies. Yeah? You know, I mean, that strong intellectual property rights. I mean, there's a debate as to whether that may be or may not be good, even for the rich countries. But when it comes to developing countries, it's not a good policy. You know? And then we are trying to impose the same policy on everyone. You know? So I think G20 is the opportunity to, you know, because now the developing countries have voice there. I mean, it will, you know, hopefully change our thinking in this way a bit. Well, Turkey's chronic current account deficit problem, you know, to put it simply, I mean, this is too simplistic, but basically this happens because Turkish the population wants to consume more than they can produce. Yeah? I mean, that's the simplest way to put it. Yeah? So how do you do it? I mean, you can, of course, do it in the kind of negative way by repressing consumption. Well, that might be necessary for a short period, but you know, it's not a permanent solution. The only solution is to expand your ability to produce. Yeah? South Korea, despite heavy repression of consumption by the government in the 1960s and 70s, despite this mad drive to export, had a structural trade deficit until the late 1980s. Because even if you suppress people's desire to consume, there's a limit. Yeah? And especially when your income is growing because of growth, you cannot tell people, well, you have to eat like what you used to 15 years ago. Yeah? So let's think in a positive, even aggressive way, and try to see how you can expand your ability to produce. Yeah? I'll leave it at that. Thank you. Oh, okay.
Okay, a very quick question.
Uh-huh.
What do you think about this, the difference between inwards and outwards policy for industrial development, meaning in particular FDI attraction of foreign direct investment? In the case of Singapore, Ireland, very open, in contrast to South Korea, Finland.
Yeah, well, thank you for the question. Well, inward, outward, once again, I think is a too simplistic distinction. Because in the end, what matters is that you build certain capabilities to be able to do things that few others can do. And you can get there in different ways. Yeah? If you're Singapore, you open the foreign direct investment, but you work with these companies to provide them with custom-made skills and infrastructure. In its attempt to host aircraft maintenance industry in that country with virtually no land to spare, they built another airport. Then you are talking. This is a country that will build a new airport for you. Or you could say that yes, we work with the transnational corporations, like Korea did, but on a very limited basis. Okay, we get technological agreement with Mitsubishi to develop a car industry. We allow joint venture with General Motors, but broadly speaking, we are going to do it in our own way. Of course, it took a lot of effort and long time, but it worked. So I think this distinction between export promotion, import substitution, inward orientation, outward orientation, they are all misleading, because in that debate we have basically lost sight of what we ultimately want. Does it? In that sense, I very much agree with Mr. Deng Xiaoping, the former Chinese leader. It doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as far as it catches mice. So what is your mouse? Mouse is what counts, because that's what you want to get. Doesn't matter whether the cat is black, white, brown, that's secondary, that's ideology.
Okay. Many thanks for this productive presentation, and many thanks for your presence and patience here.
Sayın Profesör Doktor Ekrem Erdem ve Sayın Profesör Doktor Ha-Joon Chang'a konuşma ve sunumları için teşekkür ederiz. Değerli katılımcılar, konferansımız paralel akademik sunumlarla devam edecek. Aynı zamanda Cambridge Üniversitesi öğretim üyesi Profesör Doktor Ha-Joon Chang bir röportaj gerçekleştirecektir. Akabinde kendi kitabını imzalayacaktır. Bilgilerinize sunarız.